Hello, and thank you for joining us. We'll start in just a minute as people sort of log into the meeting. We'll let everyone join us, and then we will start. Thank you so much for joining us today for this Patinkin event in Israel Studies at the University of Chicago. My name is Naama Rokem, and I'm the faculty director of the Joyce Z and Jacob Greenberg Center for Jewish Studies, which is co-sponsoring this event together with the Center for Middle Eastern Studies at the University of Chicago. It's a pleasure to have you all here. And I'm looking forward to today's exciting and interesting conversation. This is part of a series, an ongoing series of events that is made possible through the Patinkin Fund in Israel Studies at the University of Chicago. This fund was started by June Patinkin and her late husband, Hal Patinkin, who had sort of the vision and the desire to make sure that members of the community, students and faculty members and other members of the community at the University of Chicago would have plenty of opportunities to learn about Israel from informed speakers from Israel or who are scholars of Israel, with an emphasis on sort of current events, but with a kind of the critical space to breathe and think that the university allows us. And this is what we've tried to do and continue to try to do with the support of this fund. Today's event is also the first event that's part of a new exciting collaboration between the Patinkin Fund and the Israel Institute at the, in Washington, DC. So through this collaboration, we've been able to bring David Barak-Gorodetsky to the university. He's here as a postdoctoral teaching fellow at the Divinity School. He's a scholar of religion and society in Israel who studies the reform movement and as well as the relationship between Jews in Israel and the diaspora, especially in the United States. And he's here and contributing to the teaching of kind of the core curriculum in Jewish studies, and also teaching classes on Zionism, on culture and society in Israel, on society and religion in Israel. So it's a wonderful opportunity for us. And one of his charges while he's here is precisely to support the activities of the Patinkin Fund and organize events. And today is the first one of hopefully a whole series of events that he will be organizing. So before I hand the word over to David, who will introduce and moderate today's conversation, I just wanted to thank the administrators who, as always, make this event, as many others at the university, possible. Nancy Pardee, at the Greenberg Center for Jewish Studies, and Thomas McGuire and Krishna Kulkarni at the Center for Middle Eastern Studies. Thank you so much for all of your support. And with that, I will hand the word over to David, please.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to our panel and our webinar. It's great to see you all here. Thanks, Naama, for the introduction. As Naama said, I'm an Israel Institute teaching fellow here at the Divinity School and at the Greenberg Center for Jewish Studies. We are at the moment waiting for Tehila Friedman, a member of the Israeli Knesset, which is rushing to join our panel in a few minutes. She is tied up she had been tied up in events at the Israeli Knesset, which is still in session, but hopefully she will be able to join us in a minute. I want to start by just giving a few guidelines for this evening, or for this morning and evening, for Tehila and evening, and just describing and introducing our first panelist, Ofer Zalzberg. Okay, so this is going to be a webinar. This is not a regular Zoom session. You will be able to see the panelists that are speaking at the moment, including myself. We will take about an hour. We are planning to run for about an hour, in which we will have a panel discussion between me and the speakers. You can input your Q&A questions into the Q&A session. Hi, Tehila.
Sorry.
No problem. No problem. We're glad you managed to join us. You will be able to put your questions in the Q&A box. And I will start now by introducing our two speakers and just kind of setting the framework for what we want to do. So Tehila Friedman is a member of the Israeli parliament, the Israeli Knesset, on behalf of the Blue and White Party, promoting groundbreaking parliamentary work in religious, secular, and Israel diaspora relations in Israel. Tehila was a research fellow at the Herbert Institute and a program director in Shacharit, a think tank promoting a new social covenant in Israel. She is the former chair of Ne'emanei Torah V'Avodah, a modern Orthodox movement promoting pluralism and democracy, and she lives in Jerusalem with her husband and 5 children. Ofer Zalzberg is the director of the Middle East program at the Herbert C. Kelman Institute. He's an Usher PhD fellow at the Trinity College in Dublin, where he focuses on how conflict resolution addresses sanctity. He previously worked as a senior analyst in the Crisis Group Middle East program, covering Israel's relations with its neighbors, with a focus on the nexus between religion, national identity, and conflict. Over the last 20 years, he has also been consulting several international and Middle East organizations, including the S. Daniel Abrams Center for Middle East Peace, Search of Common Ground, Oxford Research Group, etc., and a few other institutes. And you can read his full bio online as well. So I just want to put
we both are friends of David. That's the most important part.
Yeah, we kind of forgot I did not reveal our personal connection, but we've all been working together, I think, and within this kind of bigger vision, which is what we want to present today. And the bigger vision is essentially about the politics of unity and the role of religion in the politics of unity. Tehila has now been encountering the kind of need to try and actually translate that into practice, in rigorous political work. But essentially what we want to focus on, and I'll just say a few more words. This is a timely discussion, both in Israel and in the US. I think we framed this as lessons from Israel around this topic. This might be a bit ambitious, but I will say that the current political situation in the US following also Biden's election and his speech, there is a lot of discussion about the possibility of unity, a lot of concern about the impossibility of unity, and a lot of questions about where religion plays in that. So that is essentially our focus. I want to start just with Ofer for like a very short overview for those of us that are not really up to date, just what's happening in Israeli politics at the moment, in terms of the number of elections, etc., and just give us a short overview of where we are at the moment before we move into the vision with Tehila. Thank you, Ofer.
Great, gladly. So first I want to thank the organizers and David for inviting me. And I'll try, instead of giving like a very minutiae, highly detailed account, to do it in a way that is to describe the broad strokes of where we are. Israel is in a protracted political crisis now for 2 years. We've had, this is the 4th elections in 2 years. And I want to try and touch on basically, why is it that that's the case? What is it that makes Israeli politics to an extent dysfunctional? And when you look at Israel's basic demographic structure, you can describe it as made up of 4 groups: secular Zionists, religious Zionists, ultra-Orthodox, and Arabs. And President Rivlin refers to these as the 4 tribes of Israel, modern day tribes, not the ancient 12 tribes. However, Israeli politics have been increasingly colored and shaped not so much by the distinction between these 4 tribes, but by a certain kind of exclusivist populism led by Prime Minister Netanyahu on the one hand, and his adversaries on the other hand, a kind of political populism which mobilizes public support through polarization between us and them, when we are the real people, the authentic people, and they are unauthentic representatives at best. Netanyahu famously quipped that the left forgot about being Jewish and what it means, and he was referring to a purportedly cosmopolitan, globalist identity of his adversaries. And importantly, we see indeed some of the adversaries, not all of them, also framing the debate as one taking place between where they see themselves, an enlightened, mostly secular camp, and their adversaries in a retarded, mostly religious camp. And some also even radicalized liberalism in the sense of taking a position according to which only rights-based worldviews, only liberal worldviews, are legitimate, and all the others are fundamentally flawed. And leaders from both sides also placed this polarization on the Ashkenazi Sephardic cleavage, giving it an ethnic undertone. Like Likud, the more centrist Zionist parties have attempted to present a combination of religious and non-religious Knesset members together. Tehila would be able to speak with more nuance about blue and white and so on, the main opposition party to Netanyahu in the last 2 years. But that party too has split into two main components, again, over the liberal conservative cleavage to a high extent. One of them more conservative, the other one more exclusively liberal. And these divides, you see them also in the other three tribes that Rivlin mentioned. So very quickly, Likud has fractured now when we have a party led by Gideon Sa'ar that advances what I would say is more inclusive populism rather than exclusivist ones. You see the religious Zionist parties have split to two. One of them with more conservative isolationist tone led by Knesset member Smotrich, the other one with more open to liberalism, having both religious and secular Knesset members led by Knesset member Bennett. The ultra-Orthodox parties do not exhibit the same kind of fragmentation, but they are the most rapidly changing part of Israeli society, and we see them dramatically divided over whether to be open to Israeli society or closed from it, when the majority is increasingly open to Israeli society, joining the labor market, opening up to internet and so on. And finally, Israel's Arabs. The joint list is now fragmenting, the main Arab majority party, among other things also over differences relating to conservatism, to religion, questions of the status of the gay community in particular. So this is why I'm so glad we have this panel, because really the topic of the panel, the liberal conservative divide, is so significant in Israeli politics.
Thanks a lot, Ofer. That was an excellent overview of where we are now. And I kind of want to move the ball to the protagonist, to Tehila. Tehila, I wanted to first of all again thank you for joining us. I know it's a very troubling time and a lot of work in the Knesset, and there's also some form of a lockdown in Israel as well, and it's a 10 times in so many ways. So first of all, thanks for joining us. I wanted to start with a vision. I wanted to kind of ask you what was your bigger vision, or what is your vision for Israeli politics when you entered the Knesset? What would be your utopian dream of how things would work out and kind of happen in Israeli politics? Especially in relation, obviously, to religion and conservatism and liberalism.
So first, thank you for having me. It's a very big question. So I want to touch it from a structural perspective, not from the content, because Israeli politics, our system, is made of the idea of building coalition, not like the American system. You have two parties, the winner takes it all. And it's kind of black and white. If it's Democrats, everything is Democrat. I mean, you have your own checks and balances, but mainly it's two big camps. The Israeli system supposed to be many small or big groups that build coalition together. Now, the idea behind it is a beautiful idea. We are, as Ofer described, a very, very diverse society, culturally, religiously, nationally, etc. So the idea is that, groups would build coalition. Everyone is giving up some, agree on, some fields that they can cooperate around, and that's the way it's supposed to function. The problem is that it doesn't function anymore, because instead of being, there is ongoing effort to make Israel as if it's two big camps. The last 3 elections were two big parties, two big, we call it gush, two big blocks. Yeah, exactly. Two big blocks. Now, this is a horrible damage. Why it's such a damage? Because it makes everything us and them either or, and it doesn't allow any kind of ad hoc cooperation. Now, I want to just describe how it looks when we have ad hoc cooperation. Personally, myself, I'm a religious feminist, means I'm Orthodox. I don't know if you understand, but this hat kind of symbolize my religious identity because it's something that, not necessarily the color, but just the fact that I have something covering my head. It's a symbol of being Orthodox and married. And I'm feminist. Now, because I'm Orthodox and feminist, I have very close relationship with Knesset members who are religious and who are feminist. Now, basically, they're coming from those two different blocks because the religious, part of the right side and the feminists are part of the left side. Now, if we could go back to this idea of building coalitions and change our systems, that it would allow us to build coalitions ad hoc, means that every legislation would need a majority, but it doesn't need to be the same majority. So we can imagine reality where when it comes to issues of women, I'm voting with my Arab colleagues, some of them, because some of them are very conservative, but some of them are more liberal. I would vote with my more liberal colleagues. And when it comes to other issues, maybe the coalition would be different. Now, everything is stuck because, and I'll give you another example for the damage. The Arabs in Israel usually are not part of the government. Why? Because everything that has to, they are in horrible situation where the people and the country are in ongoing conflict and they can choose between both. So everything that has to do with security, every decision that has to do with security, they would, so that doesn't want to take part of it. And the vast majority of Jews doesn't want them to take part of. Now, the problem is that because they're not part of the government, they can't be, that we had never had Minister for Health who is Arab. We never had Minister of Welfare who is Arab. We never had Minister of Transportation who's Arab. And why not? All those civil issues, they could take much bigger part of. Now, I'm describing it from the structural perspective because what I learned during my time in Parliament, in the Knesset, the structure is sometimes more, and system sometimes is more important than the content, because I can have close relationship with people from different groups in Israel, but if we're stuck in those, we need to be either or because of the political system. So it doesn't allow me to promote any kind of these fruitful cooperations. Now, I'm not sure how I understood I am because our structures are so different. So I'm not sure if I can describe, if I can give you the sense of what I came with the hope to change. But what I did, and those will be my last two sentences, I did try to promote those kind of corporations, even if they're not, huge, but on very specific topics. So if there was a rally of Arab women who were demonstrating against domestic violence, domestic not in family, domestic in the community, because that's a big problem in Israel, violence within the Arab society. And they were all mothers that their kids were murdered. So I joined them. And we walked together, and I felt that this is kind of solidarity. This is kind of issues that I want to devote effort for, because why not? It's my responsibility just as theirs. And on the other, another example, I had very surprising cooperations with ultra-Orthodox members of the Knesset who on, how would I describe that? Some things that had to do with corruption within the religious administration. Now, sometimes they could not take the front, so they used me. They gave me the information, and I took the front. But reality was that it was a very close cooperation. So I did try to do it like in small scales. And if you speak about vision, that's a vision. To look for the places that we share needs, interest, even if we don't share necessarily values and vision, because I feel that those places that we share need and interest build trust, build mutual, just getting to know each other. And those small cooperation can build something, a much more, a bigger sense of social cohesiveness, I would say that.
Okay, thanks a lot, Tehila. That's been very helpful. I think, you described in a way the Israeli political system vis-a-vis the American political system. Sometimes we envy the American political system that has just these two parties, and it seems a lot more easier. And sometimes this two-party kind of system that was copied into Israel, into this two-block system, actually increases divides and increases polarity. And you were talking about the way in which originally the system was supposed to work to enable this kind of bigger vision that I know you hold, that is dear to you, and that you are trying to promote with all this complexity. I wanted maybe, Ofer, to ask you a question about a vision. Like, what would a vision for a politics of unity look like in a place like Israel, or in general?
Sure. So, in addition to the political dynamics that Tehila referred to, in which different sectors in Israel are represented in parliament, there are many measures that are missing. And such a vision is advocated only by some, a vision of unity. And basically what I mean by this is constitutional democracy. As we see in some of the smaller European states, multi-ethnic ones, Austria, Belgium, the Netherlands, Switzerland, what we see in these countries is that the antagonism between left and right was so strong there that they had to recognize politically all of the different segments, all of the meaningful different segments. And this meant relying more on grand coalitions, where each and every one of the major segments was given a seat in government, or providing more for mutual vetoes, so that there will be actual consensus rather than a narrow majority of 50+1. Making more about proportionality, especially in assemblies, segmental autonomies, and so on. So these, I think, are still to some extent missing. And I think that actually there are some political theologies that can compensate for that and do compensate for that. There is in Judaism the concept of unity of opposites, which is a very powerful idea coming mostly from Jewish mysticism, that basically stems from the idea of God's oneness and wholeness, in the sense that God is present in the entire universe. And it follows from this that in everything, there is a certain divine truth in everything we encounter, even in our adversaries, even in our enemies. This is very significant in politics. It means that there is a deep reason that they are there, and that this has to be explored and understood if we are to fulfill the oneness of God. And this does not mean immediately relativism. It doesn't mean that they are as right as we are. That not at all. There is clarity on who I am, why do I choose what I choose. There is a clear sense of that. But there is an acknowledgement that the world would be better off when striving for some kinds of unity, even with the adversaries. The adversaries are there because God created the world in a certain way in which the adversaries are there. What truth is there? Why did it do what it did? And it restrains usually people from viewing the adversary as entirely evil or totally wrong, but to nevertheless be inquisitive, curious about them. I think this is a very important attitude in politics that we can allow. It's not sufficient, but it enables a kind of politics of unity. And in broad strokes, you know, the opposites in Israel are liberals and conservatives, religious and secular, at least to the extent that this is the discourse through which people are used to thinking about politics. And I think that as a result of this growing, the two blocks that Tehila mentioned, you know, this Manichaean polarization, very binary, it increased utter demonization, contempt, hatred for the other. And we need an alternative. And again, this alternative happens also in European countries where this theology does not exist. But I think that we see among, actually very often among religious Zionists, this notion shaping their politics to some extent and not going all out. And sometimes we see that they forget this idea and they are not sufficiently, in my humble opinion, guided by it. But I think it's a very significant thing. And you have it also in humanist traditions. We are all human beings. We have to deeply respect that. This is not something we should ignore. And, you know, there are then ways to operate pragmatically about it. But I would say that this is the key. And one last point. If you want such politics in a society that is so divided between religious and liberal, you need to be able to devise a way to divide resources, even share the public sphere that takes into account both a secular way of life and a religious one. And in Israel, religiosity is anchored in religious law, Judaism, or in the minority of Muslims, Sharia. How do you make room for these things as a secular liberal? And I think that there are a lot, therefore, of interesting questions that Israelis are wrestling with in terms of trying to produce a vision of unity that is post-secular, meaning it's not shaped exclusively through a secular framework that assumes that everyone will become secular. And it's in a way post-halachic, meaning it does not only hope for everyone to embrace the halacha or conditions politics. We need a kind of hybrid politics in order to allow unity. That's a rather complex thing. Maybe later today we could discuss this.
Okay, thanks, Ofer. Thanks a lot. So, Ofer, you pushed the theology button, okay, in this discussion as well. And I think this is also under the auspices of the Divinity School and the Greenberg Center. I kind of want to take us to this discussion of political theology and of the unity of opposites that you described. I just looked back in my WhatsApp conversation with Tehila, and she said she was thinking something, she wrote, I think from the Knesset, she was thinking of the unity of opposites, and she said that maybe 3 people understand it, which is some of the loneliness of trying to promote this view, and also, you know, the price paid. I will say this for and about Tehila, you know, the price paid. I think, Tehila, you've been described by liberals as this religious actor trying to kind of make our kids, you know, religious, and by by the religious side, you're kind of being accused of trying to make our kids liberal. So you're standing in a very, I think, you know, auspicious in many ways, an important position, but I also want to acknowledge how uneasy a position that is in politics in general in Israel, and hopefully here, and how we need to kind of encourage that position to take presence. But I wanted to ask you, Tehila, specifically about what does this mean religiously for you? Like when you think about this really as a religious person, in this term of unity or opposites, or maybe not, what are your thoughts, your religious thoughts on this?
I'm not sure I understand what you're saying. So I need you to explain it better.
Why is this, as a religious person, why is it important for you, this idea of political unity? Why does it have any significance for you in your religious life? Or is it just, you know, do you separate religion and politics for yourself?
Okay, that's easy one.
Okay.
First, Judaism is a very political religion. We use the term religion, though when I think about being Jewish, I don't think about Judaism as a religion. I think about it as a civilization, as as a culture, as identity, because religion usually referring to, personal connection or communal connection with God. While in Judaism, God is part, but not necessarily the biggest part of it. I mean, she's important, but not the center. And I'm joking, but I have my teenager girl near me, and she said, you said she. Yeah, I'm joking. He, she, doesn't matter. But not less important is this vision about creating a kingdom of Mamlechet Kohanim, kingdom of priests and being holy people. That's the vision of the Torah. And that's a political vision, creating a society which is built on justice, which is built on seeing every human being as equal and as created in the image of God. And, always remembering being slaves in Egypt. And that's why, treating minorities and treating others in the way we would want to be treated, and opposite to the way we were treated. All those ideas, which are so basic in being Jewish. All those ideas are political ideas and religious ideas. I mean, it's combined together. You can't separate them. And for 2,000 years, Jews didn't have the opportunity to fulfill them because we didn't have sovereignty. We didn't have the power to do that. And we kind of live in a miracle of, coming back to the Holy Land and creating a Jewish country and fulfilling or being able to try to fulfill those ideas. The only thing is we have no tradition of being majority. We just don't know how to do that. And having a very ancient tradition of legal system, halakha, the legal rules of Judaism. So we know how to do many things, but we don't know how legally, Jewish legally, how to do sovereignty. By the way, it's interesting because the Arabs are in kind of the opposite situation. They have a tradition of being majority and very coolly tradition. They don't know how to be a minority. And that's part of the complexity we live in. So for me, being in politics and dealing with public issues, there is no separation between that and it's same. It's part of being Jewish for me. Now I know you can be Jewish without it. Okay, obviously, for 2,000 years we were Jews without that. But what a privilege it is to be able to, to be part of decision on the public sphere. I always think that I'm a grateful outcome of two big revolutions, the feminist revolution and the Zionist revolution. And those are two huge revolutions that we're still trying to understand, how to work with. So that's one answer. The other answer is that, two other answers. The very painful Jewish history has to do with zealotry. We Jews has this tendency of giving zealotry a lot of power, a lot of we have this we're attracted. Maybe all the religious people, I don't know. Religious people have tendency to be attracted to zealotry, and we know that. And our history told us that this is the biggest danger. because twice we had kind of sovereignty, and twice we lost it because we gave radical people to control to be the leaders. Now, is that really the history? I don't know. It doesn't matter. That's a narrative. That's a Jewish narrative. That the rabbis made great effort to put in our DNA that this is the danger. Now, when we came back to Israel, the Jewish people came back to Israel, we needed heroes. We need to build army. We need to defend ourselves. So we had to go back to ancient history and to find those people that we can look up to and, make them part of our history. And those were the radical people. So there's a tension here. Okay, on one hand, the history told us that those radicals are a danger. On the other hand, those radicals are the people you can treat as heroes, as kings and fighters. So how you balance them? How you balance those two needs? You can feel it very strongly in the story of Hanukkah. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Jewish story of Hanukkah. But it's actually a story of internal civil war. It's a very complicated story. So we tell it in a way that makes it all, kind of independent war, but it's more complex than that. But we needed heroes. So that's my second answer. Okay, it's dealing with politics of being moderate. For me, it's kind of being true to this tradition of the rabbis of not letting radicals to take on. You know what? I can speak it forever. So I think that would be it. I'll tell you only one short story from this week. This week was huge fights in our parliament between us to the ultra-Orthodox, and it has to do with how strict would be punishments for people who don't hold the corona rules, the corona restrictions, and big part of them are ultra-Orthodox, and they don't go according to the corona rules because those corona rules are in clash with their religious needs, with communal religious needs. And it was interesting because most of the fight was done in liberal language versus religious language. And I was trying to do it in my religious language. I mean, I share that language. I just interpreted it in a sometimes opposite way. So I found myself yesterday shouting, screaming, never screamed, never. I'm not this kind of person. And I was screaming, you made up a new religion. In our religion, pikuach nefesh, people life are above everything. And where did you bring this Judaism from? You make it up. And we were into a dispute about interpreting our shared tradition. And it was very interesting and very powerful and very annoying for them because it was easier for them to fight with, those liberals who doesn't understand anything than with me that use the same terms and the same concept, but just interpreted it opposite to them. And obviously I think I'm the authentic one and they are, but whatever. So just to give a sense of the place of religion and the power it gives in politics. So.
Thanks a lot, Tehila. That was very, very helpful, both I think in understanding, the actual work of politics and religion in Israel, but also the vision you put also in historical context, and you kind of connected yourself to this tradition of moderation in Jewish politics vis-a-vis zealousness. I think I want to move to one last question to Ofer and then Q&A for both of us, like for both of you. So I also kind of want to remember to remind people, if you have questions, I see there's quite a lot of people on board and some are raising their hands or writing in the chat. If you have questions, there's a Q&A box you're supposed to be able to see on the right side of your Zoom panel. Click Q&A and put your question there, and we'll see if we can address them in the Q&A session. Ofer, I want to put this on your table as someone that works a lot with the Orthodox, or some would call zealous side, you know, trying to reach out as far as possible, maybe. And I'll ask the question, you know, it's sometimes a question you hear here in the US as well. Liberals would be asking, you know, can you really work with the more radical side of the conservative camp? Do they really accept us? What is the model by which you can really work with the conservative side?
Okay, so that's great, but just to be clear, I'm talking now not about any conservative, but really specifically about non-liberal or almost anti-liberal conservatives.
Yeah.
And we have been working with them now for a few years, and they are very interested in this. The main reason that they are motivated to engage in this is precisely because they feel the entire world is organized somewhat against them. The dominant paradigm in the 21st century, despite those who lament the situation of liberalism, is still very much modern and rights-based and so on. And if you look at the liberal-conservative cleavage in the history of Arab-Israeli peacemaking specifically, you see that there has been one approach in all the peace agreements that Israel has signed. And this has been liberal peacemaking. And in this approach, agreements are drafted with a strong emphasis on material interests. And the only references to norms and values are to those of international law. This paradigm reached its peak in the 1990s, you know, the heyday of liberalism, of liberal peacemaking, when it was the end of the Cold War and it seemed like liberalism is winning. And the Oslo agreements didn't reflect only an exclusive reliance on international law and liberal values, but they basically reflected an attempt to liberalize societies, to secularize societies. When this is the dominant diplomatic paradigm, you can't expect the non-liberal conservatives to join. Then I would agree with those who say they will not join us. If we change that paradigm and we work across worldviews and we create a diplomatic architecture that allows for that, we are in a different place, and I see interest among the so-called hardliners, spoilers, radicals, and so on, to be part of designing that architecture so that they could support it. Very few people really like being in a state of war, losing lives, endangering themselves, and so on. People basically want to find a way to live with others from that simple point of view. And if the paradigm remains that only international law decides, then it means that there is no room for Jewish law or for Islamic law. And it means that international law supersedes, overrides religious law, divine law. From their point of view, unacceptable. So I think that just to give an example of what that could look like, you know, in the very last few months, we had something called the Abraham Accords. Israel signed 4 treaties. I think Tehila had to vote on each and every one of them. Not all of them so far, on 2 of them so far. And these treaties came under the name of the Abraham Accords and included references to the Abrahamic traditions, religious, cultural traditions. This is very different. This is not an exclusively so-called secular liberal approach. This is making some room also for religious motivations, for religious imagery, when we design foreign policy. There is a lot of knowledge we need to develop on how best to do that. Meaning, there is one day a year when the clerics of all 3 monotheistic faiths do agree in Jerusalem. And this is Muslims, Jews, and Christian leaders together condemn the gay pride parade. If peace will become an anti-liberal religious peace, the liberals will go against it. We need to find a way so that peace could cohere with both liberal and non-liberal worldviews, secular and non-secular ones. And this also goes for governance, not only for foreign policy, but also for domestic policies. And we see that. We see some successes of that in Israel. We see places in which cities, which are equally divided, let's call it, between secular and religious, and we see them devising mechanisms for success. A swimming pool in a city governed by a mayor from an ultra-Orthodox party, Rehovot, the city of Rehovot had a mayor from Shas, and the secular inhabitants who voted for him wanted to be able to use the swimming pool on Shabbat, and they found a way for them to nevertheless exercise a public swimming pool by purchasing the tickets during the week, and then being able to swim on Shabbat. So we need to find creative formulas that on the one hand involve changes in effect in secular thinking about secular liberalism being the exclusive paradigm, and changes in religious halachic thinking that enable certain things that seemingly are interdicted.
Thanks a lot, Ofer. I think you also put an emphasis on something that Tehila spoke about. We're not that good with sovereignty, but we're better with local politics sometimes. And a lot of these solutions are local. They're local and they refer more to the communal level. They're less this highly politicized public sphere, and they're sometimes more practical within that context. And also you spoke about how liberalism, and I've been doing a lot of thinking about this, and we've been all discussing this as well, how liberalism has to sometimes kind of give way in terms of its bigger formulations, and understand that there is a valid worldview outside of liberalism, that it needs to be included. And there was a question here. I'll move into the Q&A in a minute, and I'll just do this. I'll start by reading just a note by June Patinkin from the family that also is here in the Q&A question. She says, "This is June Patinkin. On behalf of the Patinkin family, I would like to express my deep gratitude for all your efforts in making this lecture relevant and essential in these troubling times." L'chaim. So first of all, thanks for that note, and also thanks for you for the participants. I think this really struck a chord in the current times. I want to encourage people that have written their question in the chat. Hopefully you can find the Q&A section and move it to there. But we have a question or two, but until, I just want to, I'll put my first question now back to Tehila. We're also doing this discussion within the context of the Jewish American life and experience. And I know you've been doing a lot of work with what we call Israel diaspora relations, which is not always the best term to be used, but essentially with the relation of the Jewish people in general. And I've kind of wanted to ask you, what's your view of the unity of the Jewish people? What do you see in relation to the Jewish people that you would like to put forward that was important for you when you were working in the Knesset?
So big part of Israel, the self-definition is being the homeland of the Jewish people. Now, what it means to be the homeland of Jewish people, that's a question, I think, that for 70 years, the answer is not clear aside of the basic law of return that gives every Jew the option to become Israel citizens. Lately, I heard a beautiful metaphor for that from Dan Meridor, and he said, if you compare Israel to a company, so Israel citizens are the shareholders, and the Jewish people outside of Israel, they hold options because they can become, shareholders whenever they want. That's exactly, options as I think this is the term. Now, I find this metaphor beautiful. I think it sends us to think what's the responsibility that a company holds for its option holders. Because on one hand, it's obvious it's not like, citizens, but it's also not like just foreign people. So I think the first law proposal I tabled half a year ago, I call it the Consultation Duty. Means whenever the Israeli government is making a decision that has a direct impact on diaspora Jewry, on the Jewish people outside of Israel, it has to consult with a representation of diaspora Jewry. Now, there is more holes than cheese here, I know. I mean, there are many questions. What's a direct impact? Okay, if we put on one side, on one end, questions as conversion, or who's a Jew, kotel, how the kotel should be run. And on the other hand, question of security, war, peace, economy, okay, internal economy, where exactly you draw the line, okay? And because here it's obvious that there is a direct impact, okay? When Israel decides who's a Jew for our internal needs, it also has direct impact on outside of Israel. And when we make decision on the Kotel, obviously it has direct impact on every Jew that feel connected to those places. But, and when we decide to make a peace agreement, it's fair to say, or to go to a war, it's fair to say that only citizens should be, involved because the impact is on them. No, no taxation without representation. So, but where exactly you draw the line? The other question is who representing diaspora Jewry and how we make this consultation. So it's not like I thought I knew it's premature, but it was important to me to put the concept of not to talk about, but to talk with. Because I think a big part of the problem is that it's about you without you. He's making decisions without understanding what's going to be the impact of on people who are not Israeli residents and doesn't have a voice. And as I said, as an Orthodox feminist, I know, Jewish women were for years subject to halachic decisions without being part of the decision making, without being near the table. So I know that how not healthy it is when it's about you without you. Now it was interesting to see the reactions in Israel. On one hand, I think there are many people who feel that yes, half of the Jewish people doesn't live in Israel, and they should be part of our we. On the other hand, I think most Israel, and more, the majority living their life, the reaction was, if someone wants to have a voice in Israel, so he should be just make Aliyah and become Israeli residents. So the debate was interesting, and also hearing reactions from Jewish organization and just people outside of Israel. It was extremely interesting. And for me, here the process is more important than the actual outcome, because I'm a deep believer in dialogue. I think it was obvious also before. I really believe in dialogue, not as a tool, but as an end. Living a life of dialogue. And I think that ongoing dialogue, structural dialogue between diaspora Jewry and Israel is extremely important for both sides. We gain a lot from Jewish liberalism that was developed in American Jewry. And I think we have something to offer in terms of sense of collectiveness that exists in Israel. And just ongoing dialogue would, I think, be good for both sides. What we have today is not a dialogue. Is we use you and you use us. Basically is, support us and shut up on one hand. And from the other side is, we'll send our kids to birthright, they would come back more Jewish, but it's kind of using you. That's not a dialogue. A dialogue is listening to each other. So that's what I'm looking to do.
Thanks a lot, Tehila. I think, it was very to the point on the complexity of the relations, and also very, very practical, I think very well thought out. I know you've been thinking about this way before you reached the Knesset, about the specific ideas of representation for the world jury in certain decisions. I want to put this a bit back in context on the issue of the unity of opposites regarding the Israel-diaspora relations, which is part of what I do as well, and kind of maybe also put another option of the table, which is to say that part of this healing the liberal conservative divide is also the Israel world Jewry divide. In many ways, world Jewry is more liberal than Israel. There is a liberal camp in Israel and there's a conservative camp in the US, but essentially this idea of creating unity between liberalism and conservatism also applies very strongly to the Israel-American Jewry relationship. So I wanted to put that on the table. And also in relation to, there's a question by Bill Lipsy, which I think you answered in a way, which was, why should the Israeli government prefer one version of Jewish expression and fund almost entirely only that expression of Judaism in Israel? I don't think you are a supporter of that. So I wouldn't necessarily think you need to address this at this exact moment. I want to put, there's two other questions I want us to address. One of them is for Ofer, and this is, again, this kind of bounces back to what I asked you. Margaret asks, what's the value of unity beyond getting this done when there's radical differences in major goals? We are two different ships in two different directions. What's the point of this unity thing?
That's a great question. I think that the diversity that we see at least in the 21st century is so great that if we are going to cooperate only with those who are like-minded with us and with whom we share the same major goals, we are isolating ourselves to really in very significant ways. And some societies will not be able to hold together. It's not about getting done a task. It is that the entire society becomes dysfunctional. It is characterized more by its divides than by anything else. There is more and more acrimony. It's unpleasant to live there. And society, indeed, in terms of efficacy, doesn't manage to operate well economically, culturally, politically, spiritually. So I think that this is very important in terms of what is a healthy society. And when I look at unity, I think there are two ways of thinking of unity. One way of thinking of unity is if we all agree on the same goal and we all have the same vision. That's a very deep kind of unity, and it creates a lot of kinship also, almost, meaning in the sense of emotional kind of solidarity. But there is a different kind of unity, which is how can I agree and be part of something together with someone who is different from me? And we are united. Men and women are different and can be united if it is in marriage or otherwise. A friend of mine jokes that when you choose your spouse, you don't choose the person that you will only be getting along with. You're choosing the person with whom you're going to have most conflicts during your life. And the notion that they got married and they walked happily ever after towards the sunset and so on, everyone who got married knows that that's not precise. So we need, in fact, human lives is anchored in difference, in disagreement. Unity, practically speaking, in the most quotidian sense, is about dealing with that. And precisely, I like the way that the question is about radical disagreements. There are radical disagreements, meaning my religious friend and I, we radically disagree over the existence of God. This is probably not going to change. We are not going to be friends. My Muslim friend and I, we are not going to drink a glass of wine together. Okay, what are we going to do? And I think that the human diversity today is such that we need to allow for cooperation, deep cooperation with those with whom we don't fully share the same major goals. I think that it's a major challenge in the 21st century. And I think that in its absence, what we see is a global phenomenon of polarization across exactly the liberal conservative divide, feeding sometimes unfortunate things. I see it in Turkey, in Tunisia, Brexit in the UK, I mean, everywhere. And if we don't learn with dealing with this, our entire institutions, our entire social fabric is at risk.
Thanks, Ofer. I want to respond to that with one sentence and then give Tehila the last question to respond to. I want to again take this a bit one step further to the religious kind of sphere in saying, you know, that this is God's work. In a theological, political perspective, the actual difficult work is creating unity and peace between these opposites. This is like the biggest, in a sense, the biggest goal. This is what I think this theory of the unity of opposites create, and the more you can kind of get people into the fold, and the more diversity you can contain within that, that is actually God's work in the world. Okay, so I wanted to put it in that context as well. And Tehila, last question for you. I'll read it out. It's by Meira Brody. M.K. Friedman. As an Orthodox woman myself, I've really felt that I feel even more similar to religious Muslims as far as lifestyle, worldview, than even secular Jews. Do you feel that in Israel, that if Israel were to be more integrated with Arab and Jewish Israelis, do you think that some religious Muslim and Jews could find common ground and become a political coalition party in themselves?
Of course. I think one of my closest friend in the Knesset, her name is Ayman Khatib Yassin. And we always joke that we both wear the corner of head cover because she wears this hijab and I'm wearing that. And obviously we are more similar than different in our lifestyle and some of the internal tension we hold with our community, with our, this balance between modernity and feminism and religious and so on and so forth. Also, more radical people. I see it many times in Israeli parliament, not necessarily in good way. So the ultra-Orthodox and the Arab parties are has a lot of cooperation. I don't necessarily like it because many times it would be against liberal values. So I'm talking about the more conservative party within the Arabs. So many times they would cooperate with each other. For me, the thing is it's not hard to create covenant between radical people, even if they are radical to opposite directions. For me, the vision and just challenge is to create covenant between the moderate people within every sector, the moderate people between every walks of life. And I want to answer in that also to the question you ask Ofer, why? For me, it's very basic. First, because we don't have any other choice. And we're stuck together. We live here in Israel together, people who are very different from each other, but Israel is still a project. And if we don't create enough solidarity, it doesn't need to be unity, but solidarity, it doesn't hold. This project still require people to defend it. We can't take it for granted. And if people don't feel belong, it just wouldn't hold. So that's the first answer, just because we have no other choice. The other answer is more theological. I really believe that if God's created, I would say it's very religious. Okay, so
Yeah.
I believe that God is talking to us not only through the Bible and through the, but also through history and reality. And we can hear the voice of God. And if we are so diverse, so that's our challenge. So that's our mission. That's our religious mission. To build this colorful mosaic. And also, the 12 tribes in the Bible. So the basic concept of the Jewish people was always balance between diversity and unity, always. That's a mission. That's a mission. And so it's not easy. I'm not trying to make it romantic. It's not easy. And also we're doing lousy joke right now, but the answer is because because that's a mission.
Thanks a lot. I think there was, you really gave us both, I think, a personal kind of religious account of this, and also, this entire idea of going back into history, which is part of the Zionist revolution we're all part of. So thanks a lot really for these very inspiring words. I wanted, first of all, thank you two panelists, both Tehila and Ofer. I know it's also pretty late back home in Israel, so we want to thank you for your time and your really important contribution to the discussion. We've received very warm comments also about the things that were said, and this will also be available on Facebook and maybe even YouTube later on for people to view. I wanted to thank also the Patinkin family, which is hosting this on behalf of the Greenberg Center, and Professor Barak-Gorodetsky from the Greenberg Center for Jewish Studies, and Nancy as well, which have been putting this together, and the people at the CMS, Center for Middle East Studies, Thomas and Orit and others, which have been involved in putting this together. And thanks also to all our attendees. I hope we have managed to address most of the questions, and we're love to see you in our forthcoming events on this topic, which will be published as well. Thanks, everyone. Toda rabah.